Welcome to the American Security Council Protecting Our Freedoms podcast. The mission of the American Security Council is to educate and engage American citizens on national security matters, economic security matters, and the need for moral leadership in the United States of America. Please enjoy the podcast.
Welcome. I am your host, Joy Votrobek, here at the American Security Council Foundation. And on today's podcast, we welcome back Senior Fellow Alan Dowd to discuss the need for clarity and strength to deter a war with China. For the ASCF to continue these podcasts that protect your freedoms, we need your support and would appreciate your donation at ascf.us. We accept all major credit cards, PayPal, and even cryptocurrency. And today we will discuss Alan Dowd's recent two-part article on preventing war with the PRC and Allies Enhanced Deterrence. Both of these articles can be viewed on our website under Position Papers, the Dowd Report. Alan, it's great to have you back on the podcast.
Always great to talk with you, Joy. Good to be here.
Yes, good to hear your voice again.
Thank you.
And both of your articles were wonderful on the PRC, so I'd like to dig into that a little deeper.
Good.
You point out that since the World Wars, America has not put priority into building up our military until 9/11 happened. According to two different polls, military spending falls further on priority lists of Americans than economic prosperity does, and understandably so. However, protecting our freedoms also means protecting our economic security. And war with the PRC would drain our economy worse than the pandemic and the consequential bailouts. So, Alan, could you further explain to Americans why military spending is a priority to deter war with China and other foreign actors?
Well, sure. You know, one of the many great things that ASCF has been committed to from its founding, and certainly one of the things I've written about since I started as a public policy analyst and writer, is this notion that peace through strength works. Peace through strength, which President Reagan was so effective at explaining to the American people and promoting as president. Peace through strength is actually cheaper. Having a large defense establishment, which is funded by a large defense budget, is less costly in treasure and, of course, blood than the alternative, which is trying to cut corners, make things work on the margins. Churchill used the phrase, create moments where there's temptations to a trial of strength. Deterrent military strength prevents that, and it saves money in the long run, and of course it saves lives too. Yes. Here's some of the numbers, that back up that opinion. It's real data that backs it up. In the 8 years before we entered World War I, America devoted just 0.7% of GDP to defense. This was while, much of the industrialized Western world was arming to the teeth. Then during the war, the U.S. spent about 17% of GDP on defense and sacrificed 116,000 dead to fight the Central Powers. In the decade before World War II, the United States spent just 1% of GDP on defense. But then during the war, the U.S. spent an average of 27% of GDP on defense. The 1 year, we actually spent 40%. And we sacrificed, of course, 405,000 American lives defeating the Axis. But the men and women who laid out the policies of deterrence during the Cold War, and at the beginning of the Cold War, by contrast, learned the lessons of the previous 25 years. And the United States invested an average of about 7% of GDP on defense. Those investments didn't end all wars, of course, but they did deter the Soviets. Mm-hmm. They did prevent Great Power War. They did prevent World War III. They did prevent an unthinkable loss of life and an incredible expenditure of wealth. And of course, in the case of when it comes to the world post-World War II era, we're dealing with weapons that can really eliminate or destroy all of humankind and civilization. So that's kind of a snapshot of where I come from, and I know where ASCF comes from. with the foundation of a Reaganite view of defense. And the same principles apply to China. Now we're spending less than 3.1%. It's dipping down to 3% of GDP. And we're really getting into a point where we're offering those temptations to a trial of strength with the People's Republic of China as China builds up, pushes out, tries to form basically a buffer zone around its territory and declaring certain waters and territories its own, which are not. So we're, as we tend to do, humans in general and Americans in specific, we forget the lessons that wiser people taught us.
Yeah, and you actually got ahead of me there because I was going to mention the same. It's not just deterring war, but also a strong military allows America to lead the way in keeping our supply chains open and the freedom of navigation of the seas. As President Franklin Roosevelt said, upon our Navy and Air Patrol falls the duty of maintaining the American policy of freedom of the seas.
Exactly, Joy. And this is something that readers and supporters of ASCF know. Maybe those folks who get some of my articles forwarded to them outside the circle of ASCF supporters and readers will be exposed to a new idea here. But it's this notion is not new to us. This idea that America's investment in defense is not to the purpose is not to wage war. It's to keep peace. America's investment in defense is actually a kind of insurance policy that helps, as you mentioned a moment ago, underwrite what Secretary of Defense Bob Gates called the global commons, which you mentioned, the sea lanes, free movement of goods around the seas, through the air, through space. And a lot of people don't know even cyberspace. These undersea cables that basically connect Europe and the United States, connect us communications-wise into the Asian approaches. Those carry data, and they help connect us in cyberspace too. And those cables are protected or need to be protected by naval power. And the United States has helped in that, but the United States leads the way with our allies in keeping the sea lanes open and free. So you're exactly right. It's not just about war or deterring war. It's about underwriting this international system from which, as you know, we benefit more than any other country. This system of what some people call the liberal order, the post-World War II order, we helped build. It's the principle of the rising tide lifts all ships for sure, but we benefit from it as much or more than any other nation.
Yes, and I didn't want to jump too far ahead of myself, but I was getting to that point of we are very economically tied with China as well, so we don't want war with China. We're just trying to deter as they build up their military, as you mentioned. But in your article, you also quote Winston Churchill saying, "I do not believe that Soviet Russia desires war. What they desire is fruits of war and indefinite expansion of their power and doctrines." Do you believe that China desires the same?
Yes, I think that, these wise statesmen of the Cold War era, and Churchill, of course, was one of those rare men, he and Truman, who straddled both World War II and the Cold War era leaders during both those contests. I think that wisdom still applies here with a great power, and like China, an emerging great power, clearly a near peer competitor to us across every domain, technological, economic, militarily. It's getting there militarily, and of course, when it comes to global financial role, I think that principle applies to this autocratic regime. This same idea that they don't want war. I think we're not dealing here, Joy, as you know, with madmen. We're not dealing here with people who want to die for their cause, like our enemies in the war on terror.
Right.
We're dealing with a rational regime that has a very long view and can play the long game. Americans are not usually good at that. We were during the Cold War. We need to kind of rework some of those muscles maybe that have atrophied for a long contest. President Biden uses the term contest and competition rather than conflict, and I think that's fair. But definitely, I think, and because if we follow Churchill's guidance and lesson, he goes on to say, beyond this notion that they don't want war, they want the fruits of war.
Right.
He goes on to say that what they respect is strength, and they have contempt for weakness. I think that's true of the Chinese. That was true of the Soviets. I think it's true of the Chinese. By the way, I also think it's true of Vladimir Putin. But that's another podcast.
Yes, for another time and another article.
Right. But that's definitely the case, and I think again and again we'll see that if you draw a line with the Chinese, if you deal with them face to face, eyeball to eyeball. Of course, the Cold War parallels aren't perfect, because you made a great point 4 minutes ago. We're intertwined with the Chinese economy and theirs with ours in ways we never were with the Soviets. If you think about it, Soviets literally built walls to keep the West out. The Chinese are deeply enmeshed, and we with them, so that it's different. But those differences actually can play to our strengths, but we can use those to our advantage. I would submit that China needs the United States and its European allies more than the converse.
So here's a question that I had thought of too, since we are intertwined economically. They are a communist regime, and in 1979, I believe the U.S. had switched recognition from Taipei, or the Republic of China, to Beijing, or the People's Republic of China, the communist regime. Recently, there was an opinion article I was reading in the Wall Street Journal titled "China Has Stopped Biding Its Time." And the author made a good point that Americans have less confidence that the democratic world can bring China, or more appropriately the PRC, into a rules-based international order. We haven't seen the middle class in China or PRC pressuring for democracy either. So it appears that maybe President Xi is taking the PRC in the opposite direction.
Right.
We are heavily connected economically. However, the PRC is still a communist regime versus the democratically elected People's, or the Republic of China in Taipei. What are your thoughts, or what do you think would happen if the U.S. switched recognition back to Taipei from Beijing?
Well, I think that would. I think that that given, or that hypothetical, I just don't think is possible. I can't imagine. If you think of, we just had probably one of the hardest line, bluntest presidents certainly in many decades, in President Trump. And we also had, during that presidency, I would submit, one of the most, awful, terrible actions by a great power, and that would be the mishandling. I would submit, I'm not the only one, criminal mishandling of COVID-19 by the regime in China. And if the Trump administration didn't take that fateful step, I can't imagine another president doing it. But that being said, I definitely agree with the premise of your question, that which is that Taiwan is a sovereign, independent country. It's a democracy. All three of those things mean that the United States must stand by it. I also think that we've lived in this period since '79, as you alluded to, of basically what's known as strategic ambiguity, making it purposely unclear to Taipei and Beijing what we would do if Beijing moved against Taiwan. I think that has to go. I've written about that at ASCF. We have to shift from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity, make it very clear to both sides. A couple things. One, Taiwan should not upset the status quo by declaring full-blown independence. They're an independent nation in name and practice, and that's good enough. Beijing should not move against Taiwan or try to change the status quo by force. the only way we'd accept a unification of these two territories, these two countries, would be if it's initiated by the people of Taiwan, which seems highly likely. I don't know if you've seen some of the polls, but the Taiwanese see themselves as free and democratic, and don't see themselves as part of China. A lot of people don't realize this. I know you do, Joy, but Taiwan's never been ruled, by China. This is the Republic of China is independent. Let me be clear: it's never been ruled by the People's Republic of China. It's never been ruled by the communist regime of China, and they don't want to be. Right. So I would say that the premise of your question is a good one. I agree with it. I don't think we would ever switch. Again, I think it was a misstep to switch then. I think you and I have talked in other settings before. 2020 vision, is hindsight's always perfect, but it would have made more sense and certainly would have spared us a lot of headaches and maybe a war if we had just recognized both entities back in the early 70s when Nixon started to open up China, and that doesn't mean we would have created another seat on the UN Security Council, but it seems to me, could have been some way to recognize the ROC and the PRC, but that obviously didn't happen. By the way, I don't know if you noticed, there was a plan, a proposal, an offer for dual representation that Taiwan didn't like. They wanted the whole loaf, all or nothing. Of course, that Taiwan was a much different country than today, highly nationalist and not democratic. Let's be honest, small d. So we ended up moving the way of recognizing the mainland. By the way, it was hard in defense of Nixon. It's difficult to basically pretend that a nation of about 1 billion people didn't exist. And we did that for the better part of 25 years after the founding of the PRC.
And understandable why we continue to do business with them, obviously, and have done business with them. But I think the hope was to help them along, that they would become more of a democratic nation, open up a little more to that. But it does not seem that that's the case.
You're absolutely right. That was the hope. That was the stated policy of many administrations, and there was logic to it. There was a thought that through trade and exposure to the free world and the economically free world, that would steadily over time transform the government, like you used the term, the regime of China. That was the hope. That was the stated policy, and President Clinton was a strong advocate of this. The idea that trade would transform. President Bush 43 was as well, and I would submit most presidents from Nixon on made that case, and it doesn't look like that experiment has succeeded or will. I agree with you. I mean, there's some good things that have happened for sure with the China's opening up economically. I think well over 100 million people have been pulled out of poverty. I think it's closer to double that now because of free market principles being applied in much of China's economy. But the regime, you're exactly right, is not going to go that way. They've made it very clear that they will not repeat the mistakes that, their view, that Gorbachev made that led from the revolution in Eastern Europe in '89 and then into the Soviet Union in '91. They will not have that happen. And just you mentioned Xi Jinping. He's rolled back even this notion that the Communist Party had a principle of limits on presidential or executive power. There are no more term limits, on Xi. There used to be. His predecessors had term limits all the way back to up until Mao died. After that, they had term limits or limits on their power, but that's been erased, and he's set to be the most powerful leader since Mao.
And he's moved, to, as we can see, in Hong Kong to shut down that democracy as well. And
that's right.
Recently, the pro-democracy newspaper that they last print, apparently.
Yes, that's right. And that it's clear that China, Beijing, is pulling the strings in Hong Kong. Hong Kong no longer free, no longer a quasi-independent piece of China. He moved against Hong Kong pretty rapidly. It's a chilling message, I think, for Taiwan, and it deeply, I think, concerns Taiwan. It also, I think, has hardened the Taiwanese view of there need to be independence. They're building up their military, a defensive deterrent force, in ways that are smart, ways they should have been doing the last 10 years. Finally, they're doing it the last 4 or 5 years. And the United States
agree with you there on that. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I know, I agree with your assessment as far as my hypothetical question on moving back to Taipei.
It's just that I don't think it's going to happen.
No, I don't either. But I just see a democratically elected country versus the communist nation that's not going the way we had hoped things were.
Not at all. I think your premise is it's not going. You're correct. It's that mainland is not going to be transformed by. I've used it kind of in a smart aleck way, but there's some truth to it. The idea that if we have Kentucky Fried Chickens and Fords in China, somehow it's going to be transformed. I mean, that's kind of the blunt, basic way that we thought this would happen. But we have a lot of Kentucky Fried Chickens and Fords and things in China, and it's not, and Google and computers and other American things, and they're not transforming China.
No, I'm happy to hear that they are being lifted out of poverty, though. Some of them have been lifted out of poverty. That is a good plus there.
And maybe that emergence, like you mentioned, of a middle class will moderate this regime, but I don't know. I don't think so. I think it's better, as Reagan would say, just to deal with their actions rather than their words or the hopes of what might happen.
Yes, and as you were discussing in Taiwan, that was another point here, is that you talk very much about clarity and strength in our American foreign policy, which our motto here at ASCF, as you said, has been peace through strength. And I think we need to be clear where we stand if the PRC were to invade Taiwan or their outlying islands, as well as be clear where we stand with the South China Sea and their erroneous claims, as you mentioned earlier. Right. And then when you talk to strength specifically in the Indo-Pacific, where we need the importance of our allies there. So if you could expand a little on it, enhancing the deterrence with our allies, specifically the Quad.
Right. Sure. Well, allies were important in World War II and obviously during the Cold War. And I think they will be during what some commentators, and I tend to agree with them, are calling Cold War II. Which I think we're in the early part of, but Americans sometimes forget. I mean, we certainly are a leading nation. We are a great nation. We're the greatest nation on earth, but we have always had help on the international stage. Within, I think it was 3 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt formed a 26-nation alliance, a global alliance. That was, by the way, the first time the term the United Nations was used in late 41, early 42, to fight the Axis. And of course, during the Cold War, the core of that alliance, World War II alliance, became the main Cold War alliance, which would be NATO, of course. The same is true today. We need allies against this autocratic power. The good news is we have them. That these allies are awake to the dangers. Japan, India, and Australia and the United States formed this thing called the Quad Security Dialogue, and it's edging towards something more than just a place where these four leaders or four defense secretaries or secretaries of state foreign ministers meet every now and then. It's edging towards something close to a security partnership, not a full-blown alliance, but each of those countries sees strength and benefit from working together. The four of them, for the first time in 13 years, last year and into this year, are holding naval exercises. They're working together on supply chain resilience. They're working together on dealing with and responding to the pandemic. And of course, they're coordinating statements and visions about what the Indo-Pacific and the South China Sea and the East China Sea should be. So that's the core of our alliance and our emerging alliance in the Indo-Pacific. But NATO is contributing. NATO just, I think last week, you probably saw, Joy, for the first time ever, issued a clear statement calling out China for its aggressive behavior, for its behavior that violates the principles of the international order. And we have individual NATO nations, primarily France and Britain, that are really playing a strong and ongoing role, and Canada too. We forget sometimes that the Canadians have been stalwart and keep trying to participate in freedom of navigation operations. So we really do have a core of a counterweight to China, and that's a good thing. All these countries are awake to the dangers. The Aussies, the Japanese, and the Indians all devoting more resources to defense, a lot more in some cases, over the last 4 or 5 years because of the threat posed by China.
And they're taking, some of them taking a price for it. I mean, Australia in particular, we hear about, I mean, I know there was a 99-year lease with China in their Darwin port in the north there, which was surprising to me. But Australia recently canceled 2 infrastructure projects that China, citing national security concerns.
Right.
Do you believe China is trying to make an example out of Australia to warn other countries of what they'll face if they defy them?
They definitely are. I think you're right. Your assessment's dead on. Like usual, that's exactly what the Chinese are doing. And there's been some proposals from some policymakers in Europe, and I really think we should study it or act on it, that basically there should be a partnership of basically free world countries, you might call them, that when China bullies or tries to turn the screws on somebody for daring to stand up to, name it, their terrible mishandling of the coronavirus, or their brutality on the human rights front, or their illegal islands, these man-made islands they've built. They're legal according to a UN tribunal, by the way, not according to me or the United States. But when someone dares to stand up, that when China inevitably takes a mercantilist, punitive economic action against those countries, because China is intertwined in everybody's economy, that the free world should then sweep in and say, okay, we'll buy your wine, Australia. The Chinese are going to stop buying your wine. We'll buy your wine, or we'll buy the equivalent amount. Or the Chinese are going to stop buying, insert commodity here, shrimp. Okay, we'll buy shrimp from American shrimp farmers, or from Aussies, or Chileans, or insert country here. And I think there's something to that the allies need to think more beyond just defense. I think they need to think about economically things, because China's economy is so tied in, or China is so tied into these countries' economy. Its tendrils are everywhere,
including ours, which is the issue with between Taiwan and China's recognition. I do agree with you, as them separately is probably the better answer at this point. But that is alluding to your next article that you have written that's on our website now, as you discuss the UN and their role in possibly a new global democracy alliance.
Yeah, I mentioned the UN in that article by way of it. They can't really, the UN itself really doesn't meet the rise to the level of helping out when it comes to an alliance of democracies. President Biden is talking about a coalition or alliance of democracies. He says he's going to have a democracy summit. He says as a way to push back against the authoritarians. And I just make the case that the UN is really not the venue for that. The UN has a role to play, but it's not the venue for that. The UN is a place where there's no distinction between democracies and dictatorship. Let's be honest. This is a place where you have Russia, a totalitarian China, a Stalinist North Korea, a jihadist Iran are all accorded the same position as liberal democracies. And that just, so the UN's not a venue for that. The UN has other roles to play. But when it comes to defending and promoting democracy, and I really mean this, Joy, defending democracy, we're in a time now this isn't about rolling back autocracies. This isn't about ending tyranny in our world, as President Bush 43 said in his second inaugural. This is now, we're in a phase now because these autocratic powers are so strong that we're defending democracies. If you look at the last 10 years, the democratic space has shrunk and the autocratic footprint has grown. Russia has lopped off pieces of Ukraine and Georgia, continues to occupy parts of Moldova. China has, you mentioned, absorbed Hong Kong and has eyes openly, has talked about seizing. It uses the term reunification, which, as I said, is wrong. Taiwan. We have so the democratic space is shrinking, and it's really about defending democracies now, protecting them from these expansionist autocratic powers. And I do think that some type of a coalition of democracies, I think it's an idea whose time has come.
Yes, and thank you for clarifying that on the UN, and what your paper does allude to. His Alan Dowd's new paper that's out on our website today, and we're kind of giving you a sneak preview of upcoming podcasts here, I'm sure. But yes, I agree, and I like the idea of what Biden's saying with this global democracies getting together as an alliance, which we've already started, obviously, with the Quad we alluded to and NATO.
Right, you're onto something there, Joy. It's really, I think, this partnership of democracies that Biden's talking about, and he's not the first to talk about this. The former head of NATO has promoted this 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. Senator John McCain, the late John McCain, promoted this idea. President Obama's ambassador to NATO, a man named Ivo Dadler, promoted it. President Reagan, Joy, talked about this. This is a quote from Reagan, which I know you liked. He said, we need an army of conscience, quote unquote, to confront the forces of brutality, quote, just as the world democracies banded together to advance the cause of freedom in the face of totalitarianism. Might we not now unite to impose civilized standards of behavior on those who flout every measure of human decency, end quote. So this is not a partisan idea. It's not an American idea. It's an idea that I think transcends nation states, and I think it can unify nation states. And what I was saying, you're onto something here. I think ultimately what it might be is kind of a coalition of coalitions, or an alliance of alliances, where you have, yes, NATO is a big part of it, but yes, the Quad is a big part of it. But then you might also have key North and South American states a part of it. You might have some of the democracies in the Middle East a part of it, and so it's, but I do think it'll be interesting to see what the president is able to do when he has that summit. It'll be interesting to see who he invites, by the way, because people have different definitions of democracy.
Yes, that is very true. And hopefully those that are leaning toward more of a socialist standing instead of democracy will reconsider their position.
That's right.
Alan, it's about all the time we have for today, so if you have anything else to add before we close?
No, always good to chat with you. I look forward, like you said, you gave them a sneak peek of next month's stuff. I'm happy to talk about that anytime.
Sounds good. Thank you for joining us today. You can check out Alan's articles, as I mentioned before, on our website under Position Papers, the Dowd Report at www.ascf.us. If you would like to stay up to date on what is happening here at the ASCF, please sign up to receive our newsletters, and you can do that on our homepage. All of our podcasts are on our website as well as on YouTube and Rumble. You can just type in American Security Council Foundation to find those. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, comment, share, and share our podcast with your family and friends. Thank you for tuning into the podcast today, and please join us again next time as we talk more about protecting your freedoms.